The first thing Sarah understood about Marcus was that he was already disappearing, not in any dramatic sense. He still drove to his job as a logistics coordinator, still picked his daughter Emma up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, still texted his ex-wife about soccer schedules and dental appointments, but there was a quality to his presence, a thinning of attention, a gradual withdrawal from the texture of his own life that made him exquisitely vulnerable to someone who could promise him a different version of himself. He was 42 when they met, at a networking event in Atlanta that neither of them particularly wanted to attend. He was there because his company required it. She was there because she had learned, through careful observation of dozens of lives, that people in transition zones are the most generous with their trust. Marcus was in exactly such a zone. Divorced 3 years prior, sharing custody of a 7-year-old daughter, living in an apartment that never quite felt like home, and carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from trying to be two versions of a father simultaneously. The event was held in a hotel ballroom, with the kind of forced conviviality that makes successful professionals deeply uncomfortable. People clustered in predictable formations, the ambitious climbers near the company executives, the secure mid-career people sharing war stories, the newly divorced or recently promoted circling the perimeter, looking for solid ground. Marcus had positioned himself near the appetizer table because it gave him something to do. He was scrolling through his phone, checking whether Emma had sent any messages from school, when Sarah approached him. She wasn't aggressive about it. She simply stood next to him, selected a small plate of food, and made an observation about how oddly the event was organized. They spend all this money creating this elaborate space and everyone immediately breaks into groups based on job titles, she said. It's like they paid thousands of dollars to reproduce the office hierarchy in a nicer location. Marcus looked at her. She was approximately his age, perhaps a few years younger. She had the kind of appearance that seemed deliberately non-remarkable. Neutral clothing, minimal jewelry, hairstyled in a way that suggested she didn't spend much time thinking about her appearance. But there was something about the way she held herself that suggested careful intentionality. Everything about her seemed chosen. I hadn't thought about it that way, Marcus said. Which was true. He generally moved through these events in a state of mild autopilot, fulfilling the obligation and then returning to his real life. Most people don't, Sarah said. Most people accept the structure and move within it. But if you actually look at what's happening, it's fascinating how resistant we are to genuine social mixing. We recreate hierarchy even in contexts designed to prevent it. Marcus found himself genuinely engaged by this observation. It was the kind of thinking that required him to step outside his immediate experience and examine it from a distance. He realized, as they continued to talk, that he hadn't had this kind of conversation in a very long time. When he talked to Jennifer, his ex-wife, the conversation was logistical. When he talked to his colleagues, the conversation was professional. When he talked to Emma, he was in parent mode, focused on her experience rather than his own. But talking to Sarah felt different. She asked him questions about how he was actually experiencing his life, and then she listened to the answers in a way that suggested each word mattered. She had a quality of attention that was increasingly rare. In a world where everyone was half present, scrolling through phones while maintaining conversations, Sarah was fully there. She made eye contact. She remembered details. She followed up on things he said. "So you're recently divorced," she said, after he had mentioned his custody arrangement with Emma. 3 years, he said. It was amicable, which sounds nice in theory, but in practice it just means there's no one to blame. The marriage ended because we grew apart. No affair, no betrayal, no dramatic reason. Just two people who realized they weren't going to work out. That sounds lonelier somehow, Sarah said. If there's betrayal, at least there's a clear reason. But if it's just drift, then it raises questions about whether you're capable of preventing it from happening again. Marcus hadn't consciously articulated that fear, but hearing her name, it made him realize it had been sitting underneath everything. That was exactly his underlying anxiety. Not that Jennifer had left him, but that he had failed to prevent the leaving, that there was something about him, something deficient or inadequate, that made him the kind of person who marries someone, then gradually becomes someone they don't want to be married to. I think about that, he admitted. I imagine you do, Sarah said. And I imagine it affects how you parent Emma. I imagine you're very present with her, maybe more present than is necessary, because you're trying to prevent her from experiencing the same kind of loss you experienced. Again, She had named something that Marcus hadn't fully articulated to himself. He was very present with Emma, maybe too present. Jennifer had made comments about it, gently suggesting that Emma needed some independence, that Marcus's constant availability might actually be preventing her from developing normal social skills. "How did you?" Marcus started to ask, but Sarah smiled slightly. "I'm a therapist," she said. "I spend my days listening to people talk about their lives and recognizing patterns. You have a particular quality to you. You're listening more than you're talking. You're observing more than you're participating. You're trying to understand the world in a way that suggests you've recently experienced a significant failure at understanding something." Marcus didn't know whether to feel comforted or exposed by this assessment, but he found that he wanted to keep talking to her. The networking event, which had felt like an obligation an hour earlier, suddenly had a focal point. They talked for another hour. Sarah told him that she worked as a therapist specializing in family dynamics and identity issues. She told him she had moved to Atlanta 6 months earlier from New York, that she was still getting settled, that she found these corporate networking events simultaneously fascinating and depressing. She told him very little about her personal life, no mention of a partner or family. Instead, she kept the conversation focused on understanding Marcus, his experience, his concerns, his sense of being adrift in his own life. By the time the event was ending, Marcus felt a clarity about his situation that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that Sarah had told him what to do. It was that she had helped him understand the contours of his own psychological landscape in a way that felt genuinely insightful. As they were leaving, Sarah said something that would echo through the months that followed. "You know, I think you're someone who could be much more than you're allowing yourself to be. I think there's a version of yourself that you've put on hold because of the divorce and the custody arrangement and the sense of responsibility to your daughter. But I wonder if that version of yourself is still there, waiting for someone who could actually see it." Marcus left the event thinking about that statement. He found himself replaying it as he drove home. He thought about it as he looked at his apartment, a space that was organized, functional, and utterly devoid of anything that suggested a personality. He thought about it as he prepared Emma's room for her arrival the next day. And 3 days later, when Sarah messaged him through LinkedIn, a connection that had apparently been made at the event, he found himself responding immediately. What he didn't understand at that moment was that Sarah had spent her entire life learning to recognize exactly what Marcus was vulnerable to, the promise of wholeness offered by someone who seemed to understand him completely. The weeks that followed had the quality of a correction. Sarah was everything that Jennifer wasn't. Spontaneous where Jennifer had become practically minded, present where Jennifer had become increasingly distant in the months before the separation, available in ways that made everything else in Marcus's life seem suddenly inadequate. When Marcus mentioned he hadn't slept well in months due to anxiety about his job performance, Sarah sent him text messages at midnight with information about sleep architecture and recommendations for a sleep specialist. When he mentioned that he worried his presence with Emma was somehow holding her back from normal childhood development, Sarah had carefully considered thoughts about the distinction between healthy parental presence and codependent attachment. But what distinguished Sarah's approach, what made her different from someone simply manipulative, was that everything she offered seemed grounded in genuine psychological expertise. She wasn't lying about her understanding of his vulnerabilities. She simply had an almost preternatural ability to recognize where the fractures already existed in his life, and then to position herself as the force that could hold him together. By their 3rd week of communication, Sarah suggested they meet for coffee. By their 6th week, they were seeing each other multiple times per week. By their 3rd month, Marcus found himself reorganizing his entire life around access to her. He took her to restaurants on nights he didn't have Emma. He texted her during work hours. He found himself increasingly anxious on the days when she mentioned being busy, not with anger or resentment, but with a low-grade worry that suggested she might recognize him as insufficient and move on to someone more worthy of her continued attention. Sarah's apartment, when he first visited, was surprisingly sparse. Minimal furniture, white walls, very few personal effects. But she explained this in a way that reframed it as a virtue rather than an absence. "I find that physical clutter becomes psychological clutter," she said. "I prefer to keep my space clean so that my mind can be clean. I think most people use possessions as a way to anchor themselves, but I've learned that the only real anchor is presence." Marcus found this perspective appealing. It suggested sophistication and intentionality. It suggested that Sarah had thought deeply about how to live and had designed her life accordingly. What he didn't recognize was that the sparse apartment was also a strategic choice. It left no physical trace of Sarah's existence. If someone were to inventory her apartment, they would find almost nothing that suggested a specific life, specific relationships, specific commitments. It was the physical embodiment of her psychological approach, the ability to exist without leaving marks. 3 months into the relationship, Sarah introduced the idea of greater integration. She suggested that Marcus was compartmentalizing his life, keeping her separate from his relationship with Emma, keeping his romantic life separate from his professional life, maintaining these divisions that prevented him from being fully present in any of the compartments. "You're splitting your attention," she said to him one evening, "and I think that's creating anxiety because you're never fully committed to anything. Part of you is always thinking about the other parts." Marcus recognized the truth in this. He often felt divided between his obligations to Emma and his desire to be with Sarah. He felt torn between his professional responsibilities and his emotional availability. He felt scattered across multiple commitments without being fully present to any of them. "What would it look like if I wasn't divided?" he asked her. "I think it would look like being intentional about integration," she said. "It would look like creating systems that allowed you to be fully present instead of constantly context switching." This conversation led gradually to a series of changes in Marcus's life. The first was practical. They discussed his work schedule and identified several days where he could reorganize his calendar to create extended periods of focus. This seemed straightforward and professional. It made sense. The second change was more subtle. Sarah suggested that Emma might benefit from more structure, that instead of Marcus being available for pickup on random days, they establish a clearer schedule, that instead of constant texting and check-ins during the week, they establish designated communication times. This, she suggested, would actually be better for Emma's development. It would create clearer boundaries and help her understand that her father had his own life. "Children need to see their parents as people who have their own identities," Sarah explained. "When you're constantly available to Emma, you're actually creating a form of dependency that isn't healthy for her." Marcus understood this point intellectually. He had read parenting articles that suggested helicopter parenting could create anxiety in children. He had been told by friends that he was too present with Emma, but when Sarah said it, it seemed to gain additional weight. It seemed like professional insight rather than casual observation. So they adjusted the schedule. Instead of being available for pickup any day Jennifer arranged, Marcus established specific pickup days. Instead of texting Emma throughout the week, they created designated communication times. Instead of Emma having his direct phone number, his text messages came to the family group chat that had been recently established. This was when things began to shift in a way that would become clear only in retrospect. The group chat had started innocently enough. Sarah had suggested it, a way for everyone to stay connected. The participants were Sarah, Marcus, Jennifer, and Emma. What Sarah explained was the modern efficiency of maintaining family coordination in a single place. What was actually beginning was a systematic restructuring of how information flowed through Marcus's life. In the beginning, the chat was purely logistical. Emma would send a photo from school. Jennifer would coordinate the weekend schedule. Marcus would share updates about Emma's activities. Sarah's presence in the chat seemed supportive and encouraging, but Sarah was patient. She understood that the group chat was a slowly tightening system. Over the course of weeks, she began to subtly reshape the narrative within the conversation. She would comment on Emma's photos with observations that, while seemingly supportive, subtly suggested that Marcus's parenting approach was insufficient. When Emma sent a photo of a painting she had made, Sarah would respond with something like, "So creative. You know, it's interesting that kids with more independence in their creative expression often develop stronger artistic voices. I wonder if Emma would benefit from more space to explore her own aesthetic without parental guidance." To anyone reading this, it would seem like an innocent observation. But to Marcus, reading it in the context of the conversation where his very presence was being redefined as a burden, it carried a specific message. Your daughter might be limited by your parental attention. When Emma mentioned missing her dad during the week, Sarah would add a comment like, "That's so sweet that you miss him. You could also call him directly, though. That way he's not just focused on being there for you when you're together. It might help him feel like he has his own identity." Again, on the surface, this seemed supportive. It was framed as supporting both Emma's agency and Marcus's autonomy. But the subtext was consistent. Marcus's presence in his daughter's life was limiting her development. Jennifer, who had always been perceptive about relational dynamics, began to notice something was off. She would reach out to Marcus privately through text, asking if everything was okay. She would suggest that Emma seemed anxious about the reduced contact. She would express concern that something in the dynamic had shifted. Marcus found these conversations increasingly uncomfortable. Jennifer was expressing doubt about decisions that Sarah had helped him understand were positive. This created a conflict. Either Jennifer was right and he was failing his daughter, or Sarah was right and Jennifer was unconsciously sabotaging his growth. Sarah, of course, had a framework for understanding Jennifer's concerns. "She's feeling threatened," Sarah would explain. "When you start prioritizing your own growth and happiness, people who are invested in keeping you smaller often feel abandoned. It's not really about Emma. It's about Jennifer's fear that you're becoming someone she can no longer control." This reframing was psychologically sophisticated. It took Jennifer's legitimate concerns about their daughter and transformed them into an expression of Jennifer's own insecurity. It made Marcus feel like he was making the healthy choice by listening to Sarah instead of his ex-wife. The shift was gradual, but it was also systematic. Marcus began to unconsciously interpret Jennifer's comments through the lens that Sarah had provided. She wasn't concerned about Emma. She was threatened by his growth. Her observations about reduced contact weren't valid feedback. They were an expression of control. 6 months into the relationship with Sarah, Marcus received a concerning email from Emma's school. Emma was having some behavioral issues. Nothing serious. But the teacher noted that Emma seemed withdrawn during group activities and was spending more time alone during recess. The school suggested that there might be something going on at home that was affecting her emotional state. Marcus felt a spike of anxiety. He immediately contacted Jennifer, who said she hadn't noticed anything particularly concerning at home, though she did mention that Emma had asked multiple times why her dad didn't text her during the week anymore. This information created cognitive dissonance for Marcus. If Emma was anxious about reduced contact, then maybe his adjustment of their relationship wasn't as wise as he had understood it to be. But Sarah had a response to this as well. "Anxiety is often a response to enmeshment," she explained. "When you pull back from an overly close relationship, the person who benefited from that enmeshment often experiences withdrawal symptoms. It doesn't mean the separation was wrong. It means it's working." Marcus accepted this explanation. It fit with the framework Sarah had created. The behavioral issues at school were actually evidence that the boundary setting was necessary. Emma was learning to exist without her father's constant presence. That process was uncomfortable, but it was healthy. What Marcus didn't see, what he couldn't see because he was too close to the dynamic, was that Sarah was using sophisticated psychological concepts to reframe genuine relational problems as necessary therapeutic processes. By month 9 of the relationship, something more significant happened. Sarah suggested that Marcus's phone was fragmenting his attention in ways that were counterproductive. She had read research about notification anxiety, about the way constant connection to multiple platforms and relationships created a sense of cognitive overload. What if, she suggested, Marcus created more intentional boundaries around his phone use? This seemed reasonable. Marcus had become aware that he often felt scattered. He was regularly checking messages from work, from Jennifer, from the family group chat. His attention was constantly divided. Sarah helped him implement a solution. She showed him how to archive certain conversations so they were less visually prominent. She suggested he turn off notifications for the family group chat during work hours and evening hours. She recommended he schedule specific times, say 7 a.m. and 6 p.m., when he would check in with the family communication. "This way," she explained, "you're being intentional about when you connect with Emma and Jennifer instead of constantly being reactive to their needs. You're creating presence during the designated times and freedom from parental obligation during the other times." Again, this seemed wise. It seemed like the kind of boundary setting that therapy speak advocates for. Marcus implemented the system. He turned off notifications. He archived conversations. He established designated check-in times. What had actually happened over the course of 9 months was that Marcus had systematically removed Emma from his daily experience, not deliberately, but through a series of changes that each seemed individually reasonable. He had restructured his life so that his daughter was no longer a constant presence in his psychological awareness. Emma's contact information was still in his phone, but her messages came to the group chat, which he checked twice daily at designated times instead of remaining visible throughout the day. Her text messages, if she sent them directly, were from a phone she could only access on the family device at their mother's house since Marcus had advised her that having her own phone at age 8 was excessive. The photos she created at school were shared in the group chat, where they were contextualized by Sarah's observations about independence and development, rather than celebrated as simple evidence of Emma's creative expression. By the time a year had passed, if someone had looked at Marcus's phone, they would have seen that his most frequently accessed app was his direct messaging conversation with Sarah. His most frequent notifications were from her. His most immediate communication pattern was with her. By the objective metrics of his digital life, Marcus had a relationship with Sarah, and he had a scheduled obligation to communicate with his daughter twice daily. Emma, now 8 years old, began to express confusion about her father's reduced accessibility. She would ask Jennifer why her dad didn't text her back during the day. She would ask why her dad seemed distracted when he picked her up for his custody days. She would express concern that maybe she had done something wrong. Jennifer, watching this dynamic unfold, felt a growing alarm. She reached out to Marcus directly, asking to meet. They sat across from each other at a coffee shop, their first in-person conversation in months, and Jennifer explained her concerns. "Something's changed with how you're engaging with Emma," Jennifer said carefully. "I'm not trying to interfere with your relationship, but she's confused. She feels like you've pulled away from her." Marcus felt a familiar defensive response rise up. He explained about the phone optimization, about the therapeutic recommendations regarding healthy boundaries, about the importance of not creating codependent patterns. He found himself using Sarah's language, repeating the frameworks she had provided. Jennifer listened to all of this, and then she said something that cut through everything. "Are you in a relationship?" Marcus went quiet. Then, "Yes." "Is she advising you on how to parent Emma?" The silence that followed was its own answer. "Marcus," Jennifer said, and her voice carried something that wasn't anger but something more profound, grief. "I'm not trying to keep you trapped in a life you don't want, but if you're going to let someone reshape how you relate to our daughter, I need to be part of that conversation, and Emma definitely needs to be part of it. You can't just gradually delete her from your life and call it healthy boundary setting." Marcus heard the words, but he couldn't fully accept their premise, because accepting them would mean acknowledging that he had made a series of choices that had harmed his daughter. It would mean recognizing that the framework Sarah had provided, which had seemed so psychologically sophisticated, were actually being used to rationalize the gradual erasure of Emma from his emotional landscape. Instead, he felt something crystallize inside him, the sense that Jennifer was trying to hold him hostage to guilt, that she was threatened by his growth and his happiness, that she wanted to keep him fractured across two lives instead of allowing him to be fully present to one. "I think we should involve lawyers," Jennifer said quietly. "Not because I want to take Emma away from you, but because I can't watch you disappear from her life without having some legal framework to protect her interests." The conversation ended badly, and in the days that followed, Marcus found himself pulled even further into his relationship with Sarah. She was the only person who seemed to understand what was happening. She was the only one who validated his choices. She was the only one who offered him the promise of becoming a whole person instead of remaining fractured across two lives. What Marcus could not see, what his psychological state prevented him from seeing, was that he was becoming whole at the cost of erasing his daughter, that the integration Sarah had helped him achieve was actually the integration of his life around her, with everything else gradually becoming peripheral. Emma, now 9 years old, sent him a message through her school's online learning platform. She couldn't reach him directly anymore. The family phone was monitored by her mother. The group chat felt too public, so she found the one direct way she could access him, through the learning platform, where she was a registered user and he was listed as an emergency contact. She wrote, "Dad, I don't understand why you don't call me anymore. Did I do something wrong?" 12 words. Written by a 9-year-old trying to understand why her father had disappeared. Marcus read those words, and something broke open inside him that no psychological framework could contain. Because that message wasn't filtered through Sarah's interpretations. It wasn't contextualized by discussions of healthy boundaries. It was just a child asking her father a simple question: "Why don't you love me anymore?" The turning point in understanding this story requires acknowledging something that most people would prefer not to think about: the capacity for harm that exists in ordinary people making ordinary decisions. Marcus loved Emma. He was not a monster. He did not consciously decide to abandon his daughter. Every decision he made, every adjustment to his schedule, every boundary he set, every notification he silenced, seemed individually reasonable. They seemed wise. They seemed like the kind of choices that self-help books and therapy culture actively encourage. But the accumulated effect of those choices was the systematic removal of Emma from his daily consciousness. And the person who had helped him understand each individual choice as wise was someone whose entire psychological architecture was built on the ability to convince people that their greatest sources of meaning were actually their greatest sources of dysfunction. What makes this story psychologically devastating is that it operates within the realm of the rational. Sarah never said, "You should stop loving your daughter." She said, "It's important that your daughter learn to exist without depending on your constant availability." Which is true, but she weaponized that truth. She used psychological sophistication to rationalize psychological destruction, and Marcus participated. Not because he was weak or stupid, but because he was vulnerable. He was a man who had experienced failure in his most important relationship. He was a man who was anxious about whether he could prevent similar failures. He was a man who was desperate to feel whole, and Sarah offered him wholeness at the cost of his daughter. Jennifer's lawyer sent a carefully worded letter, not accusing Marcus of abandonment, but requesting that any changes to the custody arrangement be discussed with legal representation present. This letter, arriving at his apartment, made Marcus feel that everyone around him was conspiring to keep him trapped. His ex-wife was threatening him with lawyers. His girlfriend was the only one who supported his growth. His daughter was being used as a tool to keep him compliant. Sarah held him while he cried about the letter. She told him that Jennifer was escalating because she felt threatened. She told him that the legal system would ultimately recognize that he was making healthy choices. She told him that Emma would eventually understand that her father had needed to become a whole person, and Marcus believed her. Not because she was lying exactly, but because she was offering him the most psychologically coherent narrative he could access, the narrative in which his choices made sense, the narrative in which his suffering was justified. What he didn't understand was that Sarah had constructed that narrative deliberately. She had taken his existing vulnerabilities and shaped them into a framework where her presence was essential, and everyone else, his daughter, his ex-wife, his entire previous life, was an obstacle to his growth. The structure of Sarah's approach had been perfected over years. She had done this before with other men who were also in transition zones. She had learned what language worked. She had learned which psychological concepts could be weaponized. She had learned exactly how long it took to shift someone's understanding of their most important relationships. The reason Sarah was effective at this was not that she was particularly intelligent or manipulative in an obvious way. It was that she had spent her entire life learning to recognize the invisible fractures in other people, because those same fractures existed in her own psychological architecture. Sarah had grown up with a mother who was mentally ill in ways that were never diagnosed and never named. Her mother experienced something that existed in a territory between bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder, significant mood dysregulation that made her deeply volatile. On good days she was loving and present. On bad days she was cruel and rejecting. But the worst days were the ones where she was neither. The worst days were the ones where she constructed elaborate narratives about Sarah's inadequacy. She would tell Sarah that she was ungrateful, that she didn't appreciate her mother's sacrifices, that Sarah's existence was the reason her mother's life had become constrained, that Sarah was emotionally too needy or emotionally too cold. The accusations shifted depending on what her mother needed them to mean on any given day. By her teenage years, Sarah had developed a survival mechanism that would define her entire life. She learned to be whoever her mother needed her to be. If her mother needed someone to validate her pain, Sarah became that person. If her mother needed someone to blame, Sarah accepted the blame. If her mother needed to feel that someone understood her suffering, Sarah performed understanding. This wasn't a conscious strategy. It was a psychological adaptation. It was the only way to survive in an environment where her own authentic existence was constantly being invalidated. By the time Sarah reached adulthood, she didn't have a stable sense of self. She had a highly developed ability to recognize what identity would make someone need her. She had learned to perform wholeness in a way that made other people feel fractured. She had learned that offering someone the experience of being completely understood, of being seen more deeply than anyone had ever seen them, was a form of power. She had pursued therapy training not because she wanted to help people, though that may have been part of her motivation. She pursued it because she wanted to legitimate her capacity to diagnose other people's vulnerabilities. She wanted access to psychological language that could authorize her interpretations of why people were the way they were, and she had learned, over years of practice, exactly how to position herself as the solution to the very vulnerabilities she had helped identify. When she met Marcus at the networking event, she recognized him immediately. He was a man in a fracture zone. She could see it in how he held himself, in the quality of his attention, in the way he scrolled through his phone looking for connection from his daughter. She could see that he was desperate to feel whole, and she knew exactly how to offer him that wholeness, at the cost of everything else. What Sarah had never done, what she could never do, was examine her own architecture. She had never asked herself why she needed to be the person who made other people understand that their greatest loves were actually their greatest burdens. She had never recognized that she was reproducing the dynamic that had fractured her own childhood. She was becoming the mother who needed someone else's dependent on her for psychological survival. The cruelty wasn't in what Sarah said to Marcus. The cruelty was in the architecture of the entire structure. It was designed to make him increasingly dependent on her validation, while simultaneously making him increasingly isolated from everyone else. It was designed to make him feel that his only option for wholeness was through her. And then came the moment that Sarah had engineered from the beginning. Her exit. She didn't announce it. She didn't provide explanation. She simply stopped responding to messages. She became increasingly unavailable, and then one day she was gone. She changed her number. She deleted her social media. She disappeared from Marcus's life with the same careful, methodical precision with which she had entered it. Marcus spent the first week in a state of shock. For the second week, he texted and called repeatedly, trying to understand what had happened. By the third week, he was experiencing a level of psychological distress that he could barely manage. And then he looked at his phone. He saw the archived conversations with his daughter. He saw the silenced notifications. He saw the structure he had created, at Sarah's suggestion but through his own choices, that had removed Emma from his daily experience. He felt a disorientation so profound that he had to sit down. He had her number. He had always had her number. But the act of contacting her felt like a transgression. What would he say? How would he explain the months of reduced contact? How would he answer if she asked him why he had stopped being her father? And here is where the story takes its most damaging turn. Marcus didn't immediately reach out to Emma. He didn't turn the notifications back on. He didn't restore her to visibility in his phone. Instead, he kept the system exactly as Sarah had helped him structure it. He kept Emma deleted from his daily experience not because Sarah was telling him to anymore, but because her absence had created a psychological architecture so powerful that her physical presence, even as just a contact in his phone, felt overwhelming. It took Emma, at 9 years old, to break the silence. It took her finding a way around the system he had constructed to send him a simple message. "Dad, I don't understand why you don't call me anymore. Did I do something wrong?" That message, arriving through the learning platform where it couldn't be archived or silenced or restructured into something else, reconnected Marcus to something he had almost lost. His understanding that his daughter mattered more than any theory about healthy boundaries or personal growth. He called her immediately. He called Jennifer. He began the work of trying to explain something that was fundamentally inexplicable, how he had allowed someone to convince him that his love for his daughter was a burden. The months that followed Emma's message were not a simple redemption narrative. This wasn't a story where Marcus recognized his mistakes and everything returned to normal. This was a story about a man trying to repair something that had been genuinely damaged. Emma was confused. She was angry. She was frightened by the sudden return of her father's attention after months of withdrawal. From her perspective, her father had chosen someone else, and now, after that person had left, he was suddenly available to her again. The message that sent to Emma was devastating. "You were my backup plan." Jennifer, watching her ex-husband try to repair the relationship with their daughter, experienced a complicated mix of emotions. She was glad he was trying, but she was also acutely aware of the damage that had been done. Emma had learned something at a formative age that would shape everything that came after, that sometimes people who love you will choose not to love you, not because you did something wrong, but because someone else convinced them that your love was a burden. Marcus entered therapy, not the kind of therapy that validates all his choices, but the kind that forces you to confront who you actually are and what you've actually done. He had to sit in the discomfort of recognizing that he had made choices that harmed his child. He had to accept responsibility for those choices, even though they had been influenced by someone he had trusted. He had to understand something difficult, that being influenced by someone is not the same as being absolved of responsibility for your own actions. He had chosen to archive Emma's messages. He had chosen to silence notifications. He had chosen to adjust his schedule in ways that made him less available to her. Yes, he had made these choices within a framework that Sarah had helped construct, but they were still his choices, and Emma, slowly, cautiously, began to rebuild trust in her father. Not because he apologized away the damage couldn't be apologized away, but because he stopped making excuses. He stopped explaining his choices through the frameworks that Sarah had provided. He simply acknowledged, "I made decisions that hurt you. I'm trying to understand why I made them. I'm trying to be different." That process took years. The unexpected element in this story, the thing that reframes everything, didn't happen in Marcus's life. It happened in Sarah's. Approximately 3 years after Sarah disappeared from Marcus's life, he received a message through a support group for co-parents. A man named David had found Marcus through an online community for fathers struggling with their relationships with their children. In the group's private messages, David had mentioned that he was dating someone named Sarah, that she was a therapist, that she was helping him recognize unhealthy patterns in his attachment to his kids. Marcus went cold reading that message. He asked David for more details. He got confirmation that it was the same Sarah, that she was in fact in the process of doing with David's relationship with his children exactly what she had done with his relationship with Emma. At this point, Marcus had a choice. He could have remained silent. He could have told himself that it wasn't his responsibility. He could have decided that David was a stranger, and that warning him would be involving himself in something that wasn't his business. Instead, he reached out to David directly. He asked if they could talk, and then over a long conversation he explained everything. He told David about the pattern. He explained how Sarah operated. He sent screenshots of conversations. He described the systematic nature of the isolation. David, listening to all of this, made a decision that surprised Marcus. He didn't immediately leave Sarah. Instead, he brought the information directly to her. He told her what Marcus had said. He asked her about it. He said something like, "I need to understand what's actually happening here." What happened next was unprecedented. Sarah, confronted with the direct evidence of her pattern, didn't deflect or deny or disappear. Instead, she broke down. Not manipulatively, not as a performance, but genuinely. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been doing. "I don't know how to stop," she told David. "I don't know who I am if I'm not doing this. If I'm not the person who understands someone completely, if I'm not positioned as their solution, I don't know what I am." David, instead of simply leaving, which would have been the obvious response, suggested something radical. He suggested therapy, real therapy. Not the kind where you learn techniques to better manipulate people, but the kind where you have to actually confront who you are and why you do the things you do. Sarah agreed. The next 3 years of Sarah's life were the most difficult she had experienced since childhood. Real therapy meant having to examine the architecture of her own fragmentation. It meant understanding how her mother's conditional love had created a psychological structure where she could only feel real when she was making someone else dependent on her. It meant recognizing that she had spent her entire adult life reproducing the dynamic that had destroyed her childhood, not as a victim, but as a perpetrator. She began to understand that offering someone the experience of being completely understood was actually a deeply damaging thing to do, because it made that person dependent on her construction of reality. It replaced their understanding of themselves with her understanding of them. It made her presence essential, and everyone else, partners, children, friends, peripheral. She began to understand that the moments when she felt most alive, the moments when she was in the early stages of a relationship, reshaping someone's understanding of their life, were the moments when she was most in the grip of her pathology. And she did something that very few people in this position do. She reached out to Marcus, not to ask for forgiveness, but to apologize, and to explain. "I wasn't lying when I told you I understood you," she said to him. "I did understand you. The problem was that my understanding came from my own fragmentation. I was offering you the only version of love I had ever known, a love that required you to erase everyone else." Marcus, listening to this, felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition, because he realized that he had also been offering something of his own fragmentation to Sarah. He had needed her to understand him completely because he had been unable to understand himself. They had found each other in that mutual neediness, and instead of healing each other, they had made each other more fragmented. But this is the moment where I need to tell you the truth about this story. The version I just described, the one where Sarah experiences recognition and transformation, that's the version I offered because it feels more bearable. It's the story we tell ourselves because it suggests that deception can be healed through understanding. It suggests that people who harm others can recognize their harm and change. It suggests that there's a redemptive narrative available if we just look hard enough. But that's not what actually happened. Sarah broke down when David confronted her. Yes, but her breakdown wasn't a moment of genuine recognition. It was a moment of panic at being discovered. And her response was not to enter therapy or to transform. Her response was to disappear. She changed her number. She deleted her social media accounts. She moved to a different state. And within 6 months, she had established herself in a new city and had begun the pattern again with a new man who was also in a transition zone. A man who was also desperate to feel whole. A man who was also vulnerable to the promise of someone who seemed to understand him completely. David, realizing that Sarah was simply gone, went through his own process of damage assessment. He had to explain to his children why their father had suddenly become less available. He had to try to rebuild the relationships that had been damaged. He had to confront the fact that he had made choices influenced by Sarah, but still his choices, that had harmed people he loved. His youngest son, 12 years old, eventually refused to spend time with him, not because David was a bad person, but because his son had learned at a formative age that sometimes people who love you will choose not to love you. This is where the story inverts completely, because the reframing is not about redemption. The reframing is about the structural inevitability of deception when it operates at the level of the intimate. The unexpected turnaround in this story is this. Everything I've been describing, the pattern Sarah uses, the vulnerability Marcus experiences, the isolation that Emma witnesses, is not aberrant. It's not unusual. It's a systematic expression of something that exists in human psychology at a fundamental level. We are all capable of fragmenting ourselves for the sake of romantic connection. We are all capable of rationalizing the abandonment of our most important relationships if someone convinces us it's wise. We are all carrying the capacity to do what Sarah does, which is to recognize in someone else their deepest vulnerabilities and to position ourselves as the solution. And we are all vulnerable to having it done to us. The story of Marcus and Sarah is not a story about a bad person and a good person. It's a story about the ways that ordinary people, people who love each other, people who are trying to grow, people who are seeking wholeness, can end up in psychological arrangements where one person's wholeness depends on another person's fragmentation. The question that should unsettle you as you listen to this is not, could I be as manipulative as Sarah? The question that should unsettle you is, have I convinced someone that a relationship they valued was actually a burden? And has someone convinced me that my greatest loves are actually my greatest sources of dysfunction? Because the psychology of deception doesn't require malice. It requires only vulnerability, convincingness, and the ability to mistake one person's understanding of reality for universal truth. The months and years that followed Emma's message to her father were characterized by what psychologists call reconstructive trust building. But that clinical language doesn't capture what actually happened. What actually happened was that Emma had to learn, at an age when children should be developing a sense of secure attachment, that her primary attachment figure had chosen to deprioritize her, not because he didn't love her, but because someone had convinced him that his love for her was unhealthy. That's a lesson that doesn't resolve through apology or therapy or even time. When Emma turned 13, 4 years after the period of reduced contact, she was able to articulate something that her father had been avoiding asking. Do you know why you did it? Marcus tried to explain. He talked about Sarah's influence. He talked about the framework she had provided. He talked about his own vulnerability and his fear of being a fractured person. And Emma, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children who've experienced loss, said, "But you still chose it. Sarah didn't force you. You chose to not text me back." That was the moment when Marcus had to confront something more difficult than accepting Sarah's influence. He had to accept his own agency. He had to understand that while Sarah had created the frameworks, he had made the choices, and those choices had consequences that extended far beyond his relationship with her. Emma didn't say she forgave him. She didn't say everything was fine. She said, "I'm trying to understand why someone would choose that, and I don't know if I'll ever fully understand, but I'm learning to live with it." That was a different kind of healing. Not the healing that suggests everything can be repaired, but the healing that suggests you can learn to carry damage without letting it completely define you. Jennifer, watching this process, experienced her own reckoning. She had been right to be concerned. She had been right to bring in lawyers. She had been right to protect Emma's interests. But she also had to confront the fact that the legal system, for all its utility, couldn't actually protect a child from the psychological harm that comes from a parent choosing to deprioritize them. The best the legal system could do was ensure that the structural time Emma spent with her father was maintained. It couldn't ensure that Marcus's attention was genuinely present. It couldn't prevent him from creating phone systems that archived Emma's messages. It couldn't mandate that he care about her in the way she needed to be cared for. What the legal system could do, and did do, was create accountability. It created a framework where Marcus's choices had consequences. It created a structure where he couldn't simply disappear from Emma's life because a girlfriend was encouraging it. That framework didn't heal the damage, but it prevented the damage from being complete. Sarah, in her new city with her new partner, was following the same pattern with a man named Gregory. Gregory was, like Marcus and David, a man in a transition zone. He was a recently divorced engineer with 2 children. He was carrying guilt about the divorce. He was desperate to feel like a whole person rather than a fractured parent. Sarah recognized all of this immediately, and she began the familiar process of helping him understand that his greatest source of pain, his relationship with his children, was actually his greatest source of dysfunction. Gregory's ex-wife, like Jennifer, began to notice the changes. Gregory's children, like Emma and David's son, began to feel the withdrawal. The pattern was reproducing itself with mechanical precision. And the question that emerges from this, the question that the story forces you to confront, is this: what is the mechanism that would actually stop this? What would interrupt the pattern? The answer is unsettling. The only thing that stops this pattern is external accountability, not therapy, not understanding, not insight, but someone making the choice to expose the dynamic and create consequences. Marcus chose to warn David. David chose to confront Sarah. Sarah disappeared, but there was no David to warn Gregory. There was no one to interrupt the pattern. The machinery simply continued operating. The real ending of this story doesn't happen in the lives of Marcus, Sarah, Gregory, or David. The real ending happens in the lives of Emma, David's son, Gregory's children, and every other person who learned at a formative age something about the fragility of love. They learned that people can stop loving you not because you did something wrong, but because someone convinced them that your love was a burden. They learned that the people who are supposed to be your secure base can choose to destabilize themselves for the sake of romantic connection. They learned that there is a particular kind of pain that comes from being deprioritized by someone who has no excuse other than their own vulnerability. That's the psychological legacy of this story. Not in how it ends, but in how it changes everyone who experiences it. Let me ask you something directly, wherever you're listening from. Think about your closest relationships. Think about the people you depend on. Think about whether someone has gradually convinced you that your dependence on them is actually unhealthy. And conversely, think about whether you have gradually convinced someone that their relationship with another person was a burden. Because the psychology of deception operates at the level of the everyday. It doesn't announce itself as deception. It announces itself as wisdom. It announces itself as growth. It announces itself as love. But what it actually is, what it always is at the intimate level, is the systematic replacement of your understanding of reality with someone else's construction of it. From Sao Paulo to Singapore, from Lagos to London, people are experiencing versions of this dynamic right now. Not everyone is experiencing it in as extreme a form as Marcus experienced it. But the fundamental pattern is the same. Someone recognizing your vulnerability and positioning themselves as the solution. Someone helping you understand that your greatest loves are actually your greatest burdens. Someone gradually making themselves essential to your psychological survival. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you know if it's happening to you? The answer is, you might not know until it's too late. The mechanism of deception at this level is sophisticated because it uses language that is fundamentally true. It's true that people can become enmeshed with their children. It's true that healthy relationships require boundaries. It's true that personal growth sometimes requires stepping back from patterns that have become habitual. But the difference between wisdom and manipulation is in how those truths are applied. Wisdom suggests that you can grow as a person while maintaining your primary attachments. Manipulation suggests that your primary attachments are the obstacle to your growth. Sarah was sophisticated enough to never state that directly. She simply asked questions that guided Marcus toward that conclusion. She simply offered observations that suggested his daughter was limiting him. She simply positioned herself as someone who understood him in a way that Emma, as his child, could never understand him. And Marcus, desperate to be understood, accepted all of it. The central question of this story, the question that should make you uncomfortable, is this: how much of what Sarah did was unique to her pathology, and how much of it is latent in how we all relate to each other? We all recognize other people's vulnerabilities. We all have the capacity to position ourselves as a solution to those vulnerabilities. We all have the capacity to gradually reshape someone's understanding of their most important relationships. The difference between healthy relationship and deceptive relationship is not about intention. It's about the degree to which you're aware that you're doing it, and the degree to which you're willing to examine whether it's actually serving the other person or serving yourself. Sarah was never willing to examine that. She was too fragmented. She didn't have a stable enough sense of self to question her own motivations. She simply continued the pattern because it was the only way she knew how to feel real. But the rest of us have the capacity to reflect. We have the capacity to ask ourselves, am I helping this person understand themselves? Or am I reshaping their understanding so that they become dependent on me? Am I supporting their growth, or am I positioning myself as the only person who can provide the growth they're seeking? Those are uncomfortable questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they're the questions that distinguish between love and deception. When Emma was 16 years old, she wrote an essay for her English class about trust. In it, she described the period when her father had reduced contact with her. She didn't name him or describe specific details, but she wrote about what it felt like to be suddenly deprioritized by someone you loved. She wrote about the confusion of trying to understand whether you had done something wrong. She wrote about the slow recognition that the problem wasn't with her, but with choices he had made. Her English teacher, recognizing that this was not simple creative writing but a genuine processing of trauma, asked if she wanted to talk about it. Emma said that she didn't need help. She said that she had already done the work of understanding it. She said that the essay was her way of making sure that she never forgot it, and that someday, if she was in a position where she could help someone else avoid this kind of pain, she would be prepared to do it. That's the redemptive element of this story, if there is one. Not that Marcus learned and grew, not that Sarah was healed, but that Emma, having experienced something devastating, chose to use that experience as a way to develop empathy and perspective. That's not redemption for the harm that was done. It's something different. It's the capacity to take trauma and transform it into wisdom. David's son, 12 years old when his father lost custody, is now 22. He is in therapy. He has a complicated relationship with his father. He has learned something about human fragility that most people don't learn until much later, if they learn it at all. He has learned that people can be weak in ways that harm others. He has learned that love is not always enough to prevent people from making destructive choices. Gregory's children are experiencing the unfolding of this dynamic right now, as I speak these words. The pattern is happening in real time somewhere, with someone listening to this story and recognizing their own experience. Gregory's daughter is wondering why her father has become less available. She is looking for explanations. She is asking if she did something wrong. The question that I want to leave with you, the question that should stay with you after this narrative ends, is this: what is the difference between someone helping you understand yourself and someone reshaping your understanding of yourself for their own benefit? The answer is that there's often no observable difference from the inside. The only way to know is retrospectively, by examining the outcomes. Did the person who claimed to understand you help you become more connected to your important relationships or less connected? Did they help you become more yourself or more dependent on their definition of who you should be? Did they expand your capacity for love or narrow it to a single channel through which you had to funnel all your emotional needs? These questions are not easy to ask while you're in a relationship. They're easier to ask later, when the damage has already been done. Velvet traps exist because people need to understand the psychology of deception at the intimate level, not because they need to learn how to manipulate people, but because they need to learn how to recognize when they're being manipulated. They need to develop a psychological literacy that allows them to question their own choices, and they need to know that they're not alone in their vulnerability. From wherever you're listening, from Sao Paulo to Stockholm, from Lagos to Lisbon, there are other people in your city who have experienced versions of this. Other people who have been gradually deprioritized by someone they loved. Other people who have recognized too late that someone had convinced them that their greatest loves were actually their greatest burdens. Some of you are the Marcus in your own story. Some of you are the Emma. Some of you are recognizing that you might be the Sarah, that you have the capacity to position yourself as someone's solution in ways that actually create dependency rather than growth. That recognition is uncomfortable, but it's also the beginning of change. The final unexpected element of this story, the deepest reframing, comes when you realize that there is no final redemption available. There is no moment where everything is healed and understood and made right. Marcus will spend the rest of his life aware that he failed his daughter during a critical period of her development. Emma will carry the knowledge that her father was capable of choosing someone else. David will navigate a fractured relationship with his son. Gregory's children are experiencing this right now, and their outcomes are not yet determined. And Sarah will continue the pattern until something external stops her, or until age or circumstance changes her ability to recognize the vulnerability in others, or until she dies, still not understanding why she does what she does. That's the unsettling truth of this narrative. The deception doesn't resolve, the damage doesn't fully heal. The people involved continue living their lives carrying the weight of what happened, and the psychology doesn't deliver the kind of closure that we desperately want it to deliver. What remains is the recognition that we are all capable of fragmentation, and we are all vulnerable to someone who recognizes that fragmentation and knows how to exploit it. That recognition is the only redemption available, not the redemption of healing completely, but the redemption of becoming aware enough that we might avoid reproducing the harm. If you have a story like this, if you've been the person who gradually deprioritized someone you loved, or if you've been the person who was gradually deprioritized, send it to velvettraps@gmail.com. Include your city. Include your understanding of how deception operates at the intimate level in the place where you live. Your story becomes part of a global archive of people trying to understand something about human fragility. Your city becomes part of a map of people who have experienced this. Your voice becomes part of something larger than your individual experience, because that's what Velvet Traps is becoming, a community of people across the world who are asking the uncomfortable questions about themselves, who are examining their own capacity for deception, who are developing a literacy around the psychology of manipulation that operates at the level of love. You are not alone in your vulnerability. Wherever you live, there are others carrying the same weight.